A corrupt judge, a rigged trial, a secret network controlling the justice system. But when Vice President JD Vance steps into the courtroom, he uncovers a conspiracy bigger than anyone imagined. Will he survive exposing the truth? Watch till the end, leave a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories. The trap inside the courtroom. The air inside the federal courthouse was thick with tension. Reporters, legal experts, and political analysts filled the gallery, their whispers buzzing like static electricity. The case of Robert Sterling, a well-respected businessman and philanthropist accused of tax fraud, had become the trial of the year. But not for the reasons people assumed. It wasn't just about Sterling's fate. It wasn't even about the allegations. Something deeper was at play. At the center of it all sat Judge Marshall Davis, an imposing figure known for his brutal, almost theatrical rulings. His reputation had long been whispered about in legal circles. Harsh sentences, sudden case dismissals, and an uncanny pattern of always ruling against conservative defendants. Yet despite the murmurs of corruption, no one had ever been able to pin anything on him. Until now, because today, seated in the witness stand, was a man Judge Davis never wanted to face in open court. Vice President JD Vance. A hostile welcome. The tension thickened as the courtroom doors swung open and JD Vance walked in. He moved with quiet authority, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. He nodded respectfully to the court staff and attorneys, but his gaze never strayed from the bench where Davis was already glaring at him. The judge smirked, adjusting his robe as if preparing for battle. "Vice President or not," Davis sneered, his voice dripping with contempt, "your title means nothing in my courtroom." There it was, the opening shot. Vance met his gaze without blinking. "Understood, Your Honor," he said evenly. "I'm here only as a witness to the truth." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Davis's jaw tightened. He didn't like that answer. The game begins. As the proceedings started, it became clear that Davis was not just running the courtroom. He was controlling the narrative. Each time the defense attorney, Mark Reynolds, attempted to present evidence of Sterling's charitable contributions, Davis cut him off. "Irrelevant. Move on. I won't warn you again." His gavel slammed down like a weapon, silencing arguments before they could be made. Reynolds was clearly growing frustrated. "Your Honor, this evidence establishes—" "It establishes nothing," Davis interrupted. "The only relevant fact here is that your client is accused of tax evasion. Period. Not his so-called charitable work. Now, unless you'd like to join him in contempt, I suggest you move on." The court reporter struggled to keep up with the judge's furious interruptions. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Even the prosecutor looked uneasy. Everyone could see what was happening. This wasn't just judicial bias. This was personal. An unexpected twist. Then J.D. Vance was called to the stand. A hush fell over the room. Everyone knew this was the moment. Vance stood, straightened his suit, and walked toward the witness box. He didn't rush. Every step was measured, deliberate, as if he already knew how this was going to play out. When he reached the stand, Davis leaned forward, his knuckles white against the bench. "Stand up straight when you take the oath," Davis snapped. Vance was already standing perfectly straight. "Speak clearly," Davis added. "I won't have political doublespeak in my courtroom." Vance nodded once, unfazed. "Understood." But as soon as Vance opened his mouth, Davis went on the attack. "Oh, here we go," the judge groaned, rolling his eyes theatrically. "Another conservative fairy tale about family values." The comment sent a ripple of shock through the gallery. Even seasoned journalists looked up from their notes. This wasn't just judicial hostility. This was open disdain. Vance didn't flinch. Instead, he did something that no one expected. He smiled. Davis's expression flickered, just for a second. But it was there, a crack in his armor. "Your Honor," Vance said smoothly, "if I didn't know better, I'd think you were nervous." The silence was deafening. Davis slammed his gavel down so hard that the entire courtroom jumped. "You will not grandstand in my court, Mr. Vance," Davis bellowed, his face turning red. Vance simply tilted his head slightly as if studying the judge. "I'm not grandstanding, Your Honor," he said calmly. "I'm just getting started. A moment of fear." For the first time all day, Judge Davis looked rattled. His hands, which had been steady up until now, twitched slightly as he shuffled through his papers. His eyes darted to a particular folder on his desk, one that had appeared there this morning, delivered by someone who wasn't on the official court staff. Something inside that folder terrified him, and JD Vance knew it. The room felt charged, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Then, something no one expected happened. The courtroom doors burst open. A man in a suit rushed in, heading straight for the judge's bench. His face was pale, almost panicked. He leaned down and whispered something in Davis's ear. Whatever he said, it changed everything. Davis's face lost all color. His grip on the gavel tightened until his knuckles went white. He nodded once, stiffly, then turned back to the courtroom. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced suddenly. His voice was tight, strained. The gallery erupted into whispers. Something wasn't right. As people began to rise from their seats, JD Vance remained still, his gaze locked on the judge. Davis wasn't just corrupt. He was scared, and fear meant weakness. Whatever was in that folder, whatever had just been whispered to him, was the key to everything. JD Vance knew one thing for certain. The real game had just begun. The dark spiral. The courtroom had been in chaos since the abrupt recess was called. Reporters whispered urgently into their phones. Spectators murmured amongst themselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Even the bailiffs exchanged uneasy glances. But JD Vance wasn't confused. He was watching Judge Marshall Davis. The judge had nearly bolted from the bench the moment the recess was called. He disappeared into his chambers, faster than anyone had ever seen him move. The man in the suit, the one who had whispered something into Davis's ear, had gone with him. Vance knew exactly what was happening. Something had just thrown Davis off his game, and that meant whoever was pulling the strings was starting to panic. A mysterious encounter. Vance stood, adjusting his tie, and turned to Mark Reynolds, the defense attorney. "Something's wrong," Vance murmured. "Yeah," Reynolds muttered. "No kidding." Reynolds wiped his brow. He had been fighting an uphill battle since the start of the trial, and now suddenly, the judge who had been ruling against them at every turn was crumbling. Vance wasn't about to waste the opportunity. "I'll be back," he said. Without waiting for a response, he stepped past the lawyers' tables and walked toward the hallway outside the courtroom. The second he turned the corner, a woman in a crisp black suit appeared in front of him. "Mr. Vance," she said in a low, urgent tone, "we need to talk. Now." Vance studied her face. Sharp features. Cold, professional eyes. He recognized her instantly. FBI. "You have about 5 seconds to explain," he said, not breaking stride. "We don't have time for explanations." She reached into her coat, pulling out a slim, sealed envelope. "We intercepted this document last night. It was meant for Judge Davis. You'll want to read it." Vance took the envelope, stepping into an empty side hallway before tearing it open. Inside was a typed note. Short. Director. "The March 15th files are gone. The Liberty Foundation will handle it. Keep the trial under control. No loose ends. No exceptions." Vance's pulse quickened. March 15th. That was the date of the secret meetings Davis had fought so hard to keep out of the trial. Liberty Foundation, the name again, and no loose ends. Vance clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. This was a cover-up, and someone was willing to do whatever it took to bury the truth. The walls close in. Back in the judge's chambers, Marshall Davis was unraveling. His hands trembled as he clutched the now missing folder. He had spent years burying the bodies, figuratively, of course, but now somehow someone had dug them up. "What the hell is happening?" he snarled at the man in the suit, his so-called fixer. The fixer, a cold, sharp-featured man named David Langley, didn't blink. "Someone leaked the March 15th records. The vice president has copies. We underestimated him." Davis's breath came fast and shallow. "So what do we do?" Langley stared at him. "We do what we always do." He straightened his tie. "We handle it." Davis swallowed hard. He knew exactly what that meant. But before he could say anything, there was a loud knock on the chamber door. The bailiff's voice came through. "Your Honor, recess is over. We're ready to resume." Davis's stomach twisted. He was running out of time. The trap springs. Back in the courtroom, JD Vance had returned to his seat. But he wasn't focused on Sterling's trial anymore. He was watching the jury, or more specifically, one juror in particular, a middle-aged man, third row, seat 5. Vance had noticed it before, but hadn't given it much thought. The way the man never made eye contact, the way he gripped his knee a little too tightly whenever the defense spoke. But now, something wasn't right. As Davis stormed back into the courtroom, face red, something inside JD Vance clicked. The jury was compromised, and suddenly he knew. The trial had never been about Robert Sterling. It had always been about controlling the outcome, about keeping Vance from exposing the truth. And now, they were about to make their move. The breaking point. The courtroom air was thick, almost suffocating. Something was wrong. JD Vance felt it. The way Judge Davis gripped his gavel too tightly, the way juror number 5, the nervous man in seat 5, kept wiping sweat from his forehead, refusing to make eye contact. The way the prosecutor wouldn't look in Vance's direction, as if he knew something Vance didn't. And then there was the fixer, David Langley, standing in the back of the courtroom, perfectly still, watching, waiting. Something was about to happen. Vance had been in high-stakes political fights before. He had been on the receiving end of attacks, scandals, and backroom deals. But this was different. This wasn't just a political takedown. This was a kill shot. The verdict is rigged. Judge Marshall Davis cleared his throat. He was sweating. Not a lot, but just enough for Vance to notice. Then came the words that sent a jolt through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Davis announced far too quickly, "have you reached a verdict?" Vance's breath caught in his throat. What? No deliberation? No final arguments? This was impossible. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with glasses, stood up. She wouldn't look at the defense team. "We have, Your Honor," she said, voice tight, almost forced. She handed a slip of paper to the bailiff. JD Vance clenched his jaw. This was happening too fast. Judge Davis unfolded the paper and his lips curled slightly. And in that moment, Vance knew. The verdict had been decided before the trial even started. In the case of the United States versus Robert Sterling, Davis paused for effect, then turned to Sterling, his voice cold, triumphant. "We find the defendant guilty." Explosion in the courtroom. The gallery erupted in gasps and shouts. Sterling's wife clutched her chest, sobbing. His defense attorney slammed the table. Even the prosecutor looked shocked, as if he hadn't expected it to be this blatant. Vance, however, wasn't shocked. He had known this was coming. What he didn't expect, what no one expected, was what happened next. "No!" A single shout rang out in the courtroom, and it came from juror number 5. The nervous man shot to his feet, trembling, eyes darting wildly. He was sweating profusely now, his hands twitching. "This is wrong," he stammered. "I didn't vote guilty. Judge Davis stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over. "You are out of order," he bellowed, slamming the gavel. The man shook his head violently, panic rising. I was told how to vote. I was threatened." Vance felt his pulse skyrocket. A juror had been forced to vote guilty, and he was breaking right in front of them. The entire courtroom froze. Judge Davis's face turned white. "Bailiff!" Davis shrieked. "Remove him!" 2 officers moved toward juror number 5, but he staggered back, panicking. No, you don't understand," he shouted. He turned to JD Vance, eyes wild with desperation. "It's all rigged. The Liberty Foundation, they got to the judge. Bang! A single gunshot cracked through the courtroom. Juror number 5 collapsed. Screams erupted. People dove for cover. JD Vance whipped around. The bailiff was holding a smoking gun, face expressionless. A silence settled over the room. For a moment, it was as if time itself had frozen. Then chaos exploded. The assassination attempt, JD. Vance acted on instinct. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a courtroom shooting. This was a cover-up. The bailiff wasn't acting alone. Vance spun toward Judge Davis, and that's when he saw it. Davis was reaching for something under his bench. A gun. Vance moved first. He lunged, shoving the table forward just as Davis whipped the pistol upward. The judge fired, but the shot went wild, embedding into the wooden podium. Screams filled the air. The real bailiffs, the ones not involved in the setup, finally rushed forward, tackling Davis to the ground. JD Vance stepped back, heart pounding. Davis was done. But who had given the order? The final betrayal. Then in the chaos, Vance's gaze locked onto someone else. David Langley, the fixer. He was moving toward the exit, trying to slip away quietly while everyone was focused on Davis. Vance wasn't about to let that happen. FBI, someone shouted. And then the agents stormed the room. The moment of truth. The lead FBI agent, a tall, steel-eyed woman, stalked toward Judge Davis, who was panting on the floor, his face red and sweaty. "Marshal Davis," she said coldly, flashing her badge. "You're under arrest for judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Davis let out a breathless laugh. "You think this ends with me?" he sneered, eyes darting toward Vance. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Vance stepped forward. "Then start talking." Davis glared. Then slowly he smiled. "You're in over your head, Mr. Vice President." His voice lowered, just enough for Vance to hear. "They'll come for you next." Vance didn't flinch. "Then let them." The fallout Marshal Davis was dragged out of the courtroom in handcuffs. But the fight wasn't over. The Liberty Foundation, the rigged jury, the assassination attempt in open court. This was bigger than one corrupt judge. This was a network. And if JD Vance was going to take them down, he was going to have to play a much bigger game. As he stepped outside, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But Vance ignored them. Because in his pocket, he had a USB drive. The one he had slipped out of Davis's desk in the fight. And inside that drive, the names of everyone involved. The war had just begun. The reckoning 1 week later, Washington, D.C. JD Vance sat in his office, staring at the USB drive on his desk. He had spent his entire career fighting political corruption, but what he had uncovered in that courtroom was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. The files contained the names of judges, prosecutors, corporate executives, and political figures, all of them connected to the Liberty Foundation, a shadowy organization that had been manipulating the justice system for years. The deeper he dug, the darker it became. They weren't just rigging trials, they were controlling elections, blackmailing officials, ordering hits on people who got in their way. And now, they knew JD Vance had the evidence to expose them, which meant they were coming for him. The warning. His phone buzzed, unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Vice President," a deep voice, calm, controlled. "You've made a very dangerous mistake." Vance leaned back, unfazed. "I don't make mistakes. I make decisions." A short silence. "Walk away," the voice said. "You have a family. You have a future. Don't throw it all away." Vance's jaw tightened. "You mean don't expose you?" Another pause. Then the voice sighed, almost disappointed. "We had hoped you were smarter than this." Then the line went dead. The hit Vance stared at the phone. Then, boom. An explosion rocked the street outside. The windows shook violently. Car alarms blared. Smoke billowed into the sky. Vance shot to his feet and ran to the window. His car, his official vice presidential vehicle, was in flames. Had he gotten in 5 minutes earlier, he would have been inside it. The message was clear. They weren't just threatening him anymore. They were trying to kill him. The final move. His door burst open. Secret Service agents flooded in, weapons drawn. "Sir, are you okay?" one shouted. Vance barely heard them. His mind was already racing. They weren't going to let him walk away from this, which meant he had to strike first. The live broadcast 1 hour later, the nation watched as JD Vance stepped up to a podium at the White House press briefing room. His face was calm, unshaken, determined. The entire world was watching. "Good evening, my fellow Americans." He took a breath. 1 week ago, I stepped into a courtroom as a witness in a case of tax fraud. What I uncovered instead was something far more dangerous. The room fell silent. Our justice system has been infiltrated, corrupted. There exists a powerful, hidden network, one that has been using its influence to rig trials, silence whistleblowers, and destroy lives. Murmurs spread through the crowd of reporters. Vance continued, "This network has spent years controlling the courts, controlling elections, even attempting to take the lives of those who stand against them." A hush fell over the room. Then, he held up the USB drive. "Tonight, I am releasing the names of every judge, politician, and corporate leader involved in this operation. Their crimes will be investigated. Their power will be stripped away, and they will answer for what they've done." A wave of shock and energy rippled through the nation. The press erupted. Cameras flashed. The storm had begun. The consequences. The fallout was immediate. Dozens of high-profile resignations followed within hours. Federal agents stormed offices across the country. Some judges went into hiding. Others were found dead. The Liberty Foundation had spent years operating in the shadows. But now, the shadows were disappearing. The final threat. 2 days later, JD Vance was alone in his home office when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Again. This time he answered without hesitation. "You lost." A pause. Then, a low chuckle. "Did I?" the voice asked. JD Vance's grip tightened on the phone. "They're all going down." The voice sighed. "You really think this is over? You think this ends just because you exposed a few names?" Vance's blood ran cold. "We are everywhere," the voice continued. "We are bigger than a courtroom, bigger than a presidency. You stop one operation, we have 100 more." Vance's breath slowed. Then the voice delivered its final words. "Enjoy your victory, Mr. Vice President. It won't last." The line went dead. The ending, or the beginning. Vance sat there, phone in hand, staring into the darkness. He had won, for now, but they were still out there, watching, waiting, and they weren't done yet. The fight wasn't over, not even close.